Now let me go back to the word male in Section 2. Advocates of women's rights were outraged by inserting the word male into the Constitution here and saying that disenfranchising women doesn't cause any penalty to a state. The women's rights movement, as we have said, sort of suspended operation during the Civil War to fight for the Union and emancipation. But now, no less than blacks, they saw Reconstruction as a period of transition, as Elizabeth Stanton said, from slavery to freedom, and that women should benefit from the rewriting of the Constitution. As Stanton said, quite rightly, you don't open the constitutional door very often. She said, if we don't get our rights now, half a century may pass before the constitutional door is open. And that is exactly what happened, because it wasn't until 1920 until women got the right to vote. So here was the opportunity. The idea of equality has been galvanized by the Civil War. The Constitution is being rewritten. And one of the most dramatic or poignant way of putting this came from Olympia Brown, another feminist. She said, we must sever citizenship from the accidents of the body, race and sex, accidents of the body, which should have no bearing on what the rights of people are as citizens. Bury the black man and the woman in the citizen, says Brown. Bury the black man and the woman in the citizen. They should all be equal citizens. And of course, suffrage would be the symbol for both black men and all women, the symbol of citizenship. So the feminist leaders, now we're talking about a small movement. The feminist movement was very vocal, very articulate, but was not a mass movement at this time. But they raised a big fuss about the 14th Amendment, and they had been long allied with the radical Republicans, and they saw the 14th Amendment as a betrayal by their former allies. Now, of course, the Republicans in Congress said, and even many male abolitionists, this is, the phrase went, this is the Negro's hour. This is the Negro's hour. This is the time to get the rights for black men that had been denied them, and to add women's suffrage will derail the whole thing, was their argument. But then, of course, the debate over women's status goes further, because in a sense, now what we're seeing here is the intersection between constitutional law and common law. The common law of coverture, I've mentioned this before, puts women in a subordinate status to their husbands or their fathers. That's the common law. It's not even clear that the Constitution can really abrogate that very easily in a very enforceable way. But these women were also complaining, or that is to say, claiming not only the right to vote, but the rights of free labor. Should not the triumph of free labor apply to women? Many women had joined the wage labor force during the Civil War. Why weren't women allowed the same opportunities to advance in the free labor market that men did? Why weren't women allowed, quote, economic independence? They should be allowed the same market opportunities as men enjoyed. Now, the reality was very different, of course. Women occupied, who did work outside the home, occupied very low-wage economic categories. By far the largest employment category for women in the 19th century was domestic service. By far the largest number of employed women worked in the homes of other women and men as domestic workers, which was not a route to economic advancement. The wages were extremely low and the conditions of work were very bad. But at the furthest edge of the radical impulse among feminists at this moment were challenges to marriage itself. Certainly, demanding easier divorce. Marriage should be considered a contract which either side can get out of if they desire to do so. Divorce was very, very difficult in the 19th century. Many women were trapped in abusive and unhappy marriages. You had to go to court and prove adultery on the part of your husband. Some states barely allowed divorce at all. If there was a divorce, most of the states gave custody of children to the husband, not the wife. And so these groups are demanding a more equitable divorce laws, equitable division of property of a couple, things like that. The same law of equality that has revolutionized the state, says Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is knocking at the door of our homes. The equality is knocking at the door of our homes. Some are demanding women pay for housework. I mentioned this, the 13th Amendment. If involuntary servitude is being abolished, what about the work of women within the domestic sphere, which is uncompensated? Stanton then goes further and starts demanding access to birth control for women. They didn't use that term then, but the right to regulate childbirth, which is still there's still people today who don't want women to have that. So they're very, suddenly the feminist movement has taken a very radical turn in the aftermath of the Civil War. Here's an image of one of the more colorful feminists of this time, Victoria Woodhull, speaking at a congressional hearing about women's suffrage. And sitting to her left, on the picture right, is Elizabeth Cady Stanton over on the side. Victoria Woodhull, a very dramatic and fashionable and quite articulate advocate of all sorts of things. Suffrage, what she called free love, that is easy marriage and divorce, etc. And she's there testifying in this. Woodhull became famous or notorious soon afterwards in the early 1870s when she published a newspaper in which she revealed the so-called Beecher-Tilton scandal, the greatest sex scandal of the 19th century, where Henry Ward Beecher, the leading Protestant clergyman in the country, was revealed by her to have been, how should we put this, practicing Christian love, a little too literally, with Elizabeth Tilton, one of his parishioners and the wife of a major editor, Theodore Tilton, of a Reform magazine. But of course what happened then was respectable opinion went, allied with Beecher, and Woodhull was literally driven out of the country. She moved to England, where she married an English earl and did pretty well for herself. But the point is, even as Stanton, Anthony, and these others are speaking of liberalizing divorce, questioning some of the bases of the marriage situation, in fact, as we said, former slaves are flocking to get married. And the federal government is promoting marriage, and the Freedmen's Bureau is promoting marriage. And most white women do not see marriage as an abusive thing, but as a sacred covenant, a sacrament. And so that movement, that impulse doesn't get anywhere at this point. Most Republicans saw the end of slavery not as empowering women, but as empowering men to occupy as we said this a week ago, to occupy their traditional role, which had been denied them, of head of the household. Restoring the freed people's manhood was central to the definition of freedom for both black and white commentators at this time. So the women's impulse, spurred by the war and galvanized in Reconstruction, does not succeed. Women are not written into the right to vote when it comes, as we'll see in a minute, and divorce laws are not revised. The end result of this, though, is a severing of the historic connection between the women's movement in this country and the abolitionist tradition. And in a sense, these women leaders basically conclude you cannot trust men to advocate for women's rights. And the result is the formation of independent women's organizations severed from the radicals and severed from the abolitionists, which will lead the fight for women's suffrage in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and into the 20th century. Severing them is a plus in the sense that it leads to women's organizations run by women with women's suffrage as the issue, not just one among many, but cutting loose from the egalitarian principles of the radicals and the abolitionists removes a barrier, let's put it that way, to the women's movement allying with other groups in the society. And so finally, by the turn of the century, the leading women's suffrage organization is very racist in many of its ideas and outlook, because they're just looking for anyone who'll speak for women's suffrage. It doesn't matter what their views are on anything else. That's a whole other story. But the point is, even the radicals, the abolitionists, in the eyes of these feminists, fell far, as Francis Gage says, fell far short of the true idea of equality, and that's one of the limits of the egalitarian impulse in Reconstruction.